Hello everyone. Tonight, we are stepping onto a dusty, windswept plain where the air smells faintly of dry grass and distant campfires. Somewhere out there, beyond the haze of morning, two of the greatest armies the ancient world ever saw, staring each other down. And if you're thinking this is going to be a casual morning stroll through the countryside, well, you will not survive this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. The Macedonian camp was already stirring before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Armor clinked in rhythmic beats as soldiers, strapped on greaves and tightened cuirasses. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied sharply, perhaps sensing the tension in the air more keenly than any man could. Alexander's army had been on the march for weeks, but here, on the plains near the village of Gaugamela, they knew the real trial awaited. Across the dusty expanse, faint shapes glimmered in the dawn light. At first, they could have been mirages, but as the sun rose higher, the outlines sharpened, ranks upon ranks of Persian troops, stretching farther than the eye could follow, their spears like a forest swaying in the breeze. Someone muttered that there were more Persians here than stars in the night sky. Someone else, less poetic, said it looked like the gods had tipped over a giant salt jar and spilled men across the earth. Alexander himself rose before dawn. He had a habit of sleeping soundly the night before battle, a fact that baffled his officers and occasionally irritated them. While the rest lay awake, eyes tracing cracks in their tent ceilings, the young king seemed to drift into dreams without a care. Historians still debate whether it was supreme confidence or just the exhaustion of constant campaigning. Whatever the reason, his demeanor that morning radiated calm. Even as his men stole nervous glances toward the horizon, they could see the Persians making their preparations. Chariots with gleaming scythes attached to their wheels, armored cavalry in lacquered scale mail, and foot soldiers in colorful robes under bronze helmets. Even from this distance, the gold of Darius's royal standard caught the sunlight and blazed like a miniature sun. The size of the Persian host was not just was intimidating by design. Every inch of it was meant to make Alexander doubt, but Alexander was not the doubting kind. Standing beside his horse Bucephalus, he studied the enemy line with the intensity of a man memorizing every detail of a puzzle. His generals, Parmenion and Philotas among them, gathered nearby, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to outright grim. They knew the battle ahead would test not only the courage of the Macedonians, but also the razor edge of their discipline. Somewhere behind the lines, a soldier was trying to eat a breakfast of barley porridge and dropping more of it on the ground than into his mouth. Another was humming an off-key tune about home. And a third was busy explaining again how he'd once wrestled a wild boar bare-handed, much to the eye-rolling of everyone within earshot. Humor, even of the exaggerated sort, had its place before a fight. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened, and the noise of preparation on both sides grew into a steady hum. The wind carried the faint beat of Persian war drums, their deep thud echoing across the plain like a heartbeat. It was meant to unnerve, to set a rhythm that would burrow into the minds of their enemies. Macedonian soldiers simply tightened their grips on spear shafts and adjusted their helmets. Alexander's orders for the day were already set in his mind. He would not simply hurl his army forward and hope for the best. He had studied this terrain, noted its slight slope and its deceptive openness. Somewhere out there, among the thousands of Persian feet, he saw opportunities waiting to be exploited. What neither side knew yet was just how strange the day would become. In a few hours, the sun would bake the ground hard, men would be shouting, themselves hoarse, and the air would be thick with dust and fear. But here, in these last moments before history erupted, the plain still held a fragile silence, broken only by the restless stamping of hooves and the soft murmur of soldiers trying to steady their nerves. Alexander walked a slow circuit of his troops, speaking to them in small clusters. His words weren't grand speeches, but personal reminders that they had faced greater odds before, that they were not just fighting for pay or plunder, but for the future of Macedonia itself. In return, the men straightened their backs and gripped their weapons tighter. The day was young, but the weight of what was about to happen pressed down like the midday sun. And somewhere, beyond the sea of Persian spears, Darius himself was making his own final preparations, convinced that the fate of empires would be decided here. The Persian king Darius did not rise quietly. His camp awoke to a spectacle. Horns blared, drums pounded, and attendants bustled about, as if preparing for a royal procession, rather than the bloodiest confrontation of his reign. Enough to shelter a small village was a sea of embroidered silks, its walls painted with scenes of past Persian triumphs. Outside, the full scale of his army unfolded in waves, cavalry glittering under polished bronze helmets, infantry in brightly dyed tunics of saffron, indigo, and scarlet, and chariots fitted with gleaming scythe blades, meant to mow down enemies like wheat. Even the horses wore armor that shimmered like fish scales in the morning light. This was not just an army, it was theater, meant to impress and terrify in equal measure. Darius himself mounted a tall, white Nisaean stallion, its mane braided with gold thread. His robe was trimmed in purple and sewn with tiny golden lions, each paw clutching a gemstone. Historians still debate whether his ornate display was a calculated move to inspire loyalty or an unwise choice that made him stand out like a beacon for enemy archers. Either way, the man looked every inch a king. From the Macedonian lines, Alexander and his generals could see the Persian arrangement taking shape. The sheer width of their formation threatened to envelop his smaller force. Archers stood behind the front line, ready to rain death from afar. Cavalry wings extended outward like the arms of some massive creature poised to wrap around its prey. And then there were the war chariots, dozens of them each, fitted with rotating scythes that glinted dangerously as they caught the light. A murmur ran through the Macedonian ranks as the spectacle grew clearer. One soldier muttered that the Persians looked like they'd raided the treasuries of every kingdom in the east. Another replied that all the gold in the world wouldn't help them if they couldn't keep their lines straight once the fighting began. Soldiers had their ways of cutting fear down to size. Far off to the right, Persian engineers were seen smoothing the ground, removing rocks and filling ruts. It seemed like an odd detail until Parmenion, Alexander's veteran general, noted its purpose. They were clearing paths for the scythed chariots to charge without hindrance. Alexander filed that information away with the calm of someone collecting chess pieces. The drums on the Persian side grew louder, echoing across the plain. To the Macedonians, it felt like a pulse, a slow and steady reminder that their enemy was awake, ready, and numerous beyond counting. The air seemed to vibrate with it. Still, Alexander did not rush. He simply studied. Every small movement in Darius's camp was a clue. Every shift in formation was a potential opening. Then came the most unexpected detail of the morning. A flight of bird starlings perhaps rose suddenly from the Persian lines, startled by some unseen movement, and wheeled high above the field. Superstitious soldiers on both sides took it as a sign. Macedonians claimed the birds were fleeing the Persian army, while Persians insisted they were circling protectively over their king. No one could agree, of course, but everyone kept glancing upward, as if the birds might yet reveal the battle's outcome. Alexander's own camp was far less theatrical but no less disciplined. His men formed up in the familiar phalanx blocks. Their sarissest, those impossibly long spears pointed skyward in neat rows, like a porcupine bristling before a fight. The companion cavalry prepared on the right flank, their armor duller than the Persians but no less deadly in purpose. The contrast between the two leaders could not have been sharper. Darius stood at the heart of a sprawling, glittering host, a figure meant to embody imperial grandeur. Alexander, lean and sharp-eyed, moved constantly among his men, a general who preferred the dust and noise of the front lines to the safety of a distant perch. One Macedonian, trying to lighten the mood, joked that Darius's gold-covered robe was probably heavier than the armor they'd have to fight in all day. Another quipped back that maybe that was Alexander's real strategy tire, the king out with his own wardrobe. Even in the shadow of history's great battles, a little sarcasm survived. By mid-morning, both armies were fully deployed. The distance between them seemed small enough that an eager horse could cross it in a matter of minutes, yet neither side moved to close it. This was the tense pause before the first note of a song that would be remembered for centuries. Each commander knew the other was watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to commit. And somewhere, in that narrow strip of no man's land, the fate of an empire balanced on the knife's edge of a decision yet to be made. Alexander was not a man to rush the opening moves of a battle, especially not one like this. His army was smaller, dramatically so, but he had turned such disadvantages into victories before. At the plains of Gaugamela, his plan relied on precision, not brute force. He began by ordering a slow, deliberate advance of the Macedonian right wing. To most soldiers, it looked like an odd sideways creep rather than an attack, more like a dance step than a charge. But every pace carried them farther to the right, stretching Darius's line and pulling the Persian cavalry away from its strong center. The Persians, seeing this, shifted to match the movement, exactly as Alexander had hoped. Historians still debate whether Darius realized the trap at this stage or believed Alexander was simply trying to avoid direct engagement. Whatever the truth, the Persian king did not halt his cavalry's gradual drift. The great, glittering army began to ripple outward like fabric tugged at one corner. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx held its place. Saracens angled forward in disciplined rows. Those spears, twice the length of most, were not just weapons, they were a moving wall, and no sane enemy would crash head-on into it without a plan. Behind them, archers and javelin throwers shifted restlessly, awaiting the moment when they could unleash a rain of death on the oncoming Persians. In the Persian camp, Darius's officers were growing impatient. Some urged an immediate chariot charge to break the Macedonian formation before it could maneuver further. Others counseled waiting, letting the Persians' greater numbers close the noose. The royal chariot sat at the center, its golden laid frame a beacon even amid thousands. Darius gripped the reins loosely, his gaze never leaving the shifting Macedonian right wing. Then came the signal. Persian horns blared, and the scythed chariots lurched forward. Dozens of them surged across the cleared ground, their wheel-mounted blades spinning like the teeth of some ancient machine. Dust rose in thick plumes as the horses thundered toward the Macedonian lines. The Macedonians did not meet them head-on. Instead, the front ranks opened at calculated intervals, forming lanes. Javelin throwers and archers along these lanes poured fire into the charging chariots. Horses screamed, drivers fell, and the deadly momentum faltered. The few chariots that reached the phalanx found their wheels caught in caltrops iron spikes, scattered earlier that morning. Within minutes, the terrifying machines were reduced to wreckage, their threat blunted before the real fighting had even begun. Alexander had anticipated this moment. While the Persian center reeled from the failure of the chariot charge, he continued to push his right wing farther outward, luring more of Darius's cavalry to that flank. The Persian formation was stretching dangerously thin in the middle, a weakness that would not go unnoticed for long. Somewhere among the Macedonian ranks, a soldier muttered that the Persians should have brought fewer chariots and more lunch, earning a round of nervous chuckles. Even here, on the edge of history, humor had a way of slipping past fear, but Alexander was already thinking ahead. The chariots had failed, and the Persians would soon realize their advantage lay in sheer numbers. The next phase of the battle would decide whether those numbers could be turned against them or whether the Macedonians would be swallowed whole. The air now was thick with dust, the sun beating down mercilessly on both armies. Sweat trickled into eyes, hands tightened on weapons, and the space between the two forces seemed to shrink by the heartbeat. The opening moves were over. The real storm was about to begin. The Persian cavalry began to surge forward, their horses pounding the earth in a thunder that seemed to roll across the entire plain. From the Macedonian vantage, it looked as if a living tide was sweeping toward them, armored riders with long spears lowered, bronze and leather flashing in the midday sun. On Alexander's far left, Parmenion braced his men for the incoming wave. His orders were clear: hold at all costs. The left wing was the shield, meant to absorb the Persian assault and keep the enemy from folding the Macedonian line in half. It was an unenviable job, one that required discipline bordering on stubbornness. On the right, Alexander readied the companions. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were his elite, handpicked for skill and loyalty, their lances tipped with wickedly sharp iron. The young king's plan hinged on timing, and timing depended on patience. He would not throw them into the fray until the Persian center opened, wide enough to be split. The clash came quickly. Persian horse crashed into Macedonian formations like a hammer against a wall. The phalanx absorbed the impact with the deep, shuddering groan of wood and muscle straining together. Saracens jabbed into gaps between shields, horses reared, and the air filled with the shouts of men straining to push their enemy back. Somewhere along the line, a Persian rider in a saffron tunic broke through, only to find himself staring down a Macedonian infantryman twice his size, who promptly smacked him off his saddle with the flat of his spear. Moments like these passed too quickly to count small victories and small losses, each rippling through the morale of the men around them. On the Persian side, Darius's immortals, his elite guard, pressed forward with a cold efficiency. Their shields were covered in brightly painted patterns, their short spears darting like vipers in the gaps of the Macedonian formation, even as the chariots lay wrecked behind them. These soldiers fought with the precision of a well-drilled machine. Alexander's gaze kept darting to the center. He could see it now. The Persian line, stretched thinner and thinner by his rightward drift, was beginning to bow inward. This was the beginning of the gap he had been waiting for. The temptation to strike immediately was strong, but he held back. A premature charge could see his cavalry swallowed before the infantry could support them. Then came an unexpected twist. To Persian archers, massed in the center, began loosing volleys into the Macedonian ranks. Arrows fell in dark clouds, thudding into shields and thumping against armor. A few found their mark, but the phalanx closed ranks, shields angling to catch the deadly rain. One Macedonian muttered that he'd fought bigger hailstorms back home, and the men around him laughed, the sound carrying oddly through the chaos. Still, Alexander knew they could not linger under such fire for long. He signaled for his right wing to angle even farther outward, pulling the Persian cavalry with them like a fish on a hook. The center gap widened just enough for the possibility of a decisive strike. The plain was now a blur of motion, horses wheeling, infantry grinding forward, arrows arcing overhead. The air tasted of dust and sweat, and every heartbeat seemed to last a lifetime. Somewhere beyond the haze, Darius remained at the heart of his army, watching the shape of the battle shift in ways he had not planned. Alexander could feel it. The moment was close. One more tug on the Persian formation, one more step into his trap, and he would unleash the hammer that could shatter the empire. The Persian cavalry on Alexander's right continued to bite at his flank, but their movements had become reactive, not commanding. Every time they shifted, the companions shifted farther, dragging them away from the heart of the fight. The dust cloud between the two wings was now so thick that shapes blurred into ghosts, and the clang of weapons came as much from echoes as from steel itself. Alexander's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked on the Persian center. The formation that had begun the day as an impenetrable wall was bending. It was subtle, perhaps invisible to Darius, but to a strategist like Alexander, it was the first crack in a dam, and once a crack appeared, the water would always find a way through. He raised his right hand. The companions knew this signal. They straightened in their saddles, adjusted their grips on the Zeiston lances, and leaned forward as their horses snorted and pawed at the earth. This was not yet the charge, but the air itself seemed to tremble in anticipation. Darius, unaware of the danger, was focused on his left, where Parmenian's wing was locked in a desperate stand. Persian cavalry there had begun to push dangerously, close to breaking through. Messengers rushed to and from the royal chariot, voices rising in a mixture of urgency and confusion. And then came the moment Alexander had been waiting for. A slight overextension by the Persian left wing left a yawning space in the terror, space just wide enough for a column of horsemen to slip through. Alexander gave the signal. The companions surged forward. Like a released spring, hooves struck the ground in unison, the thunder of their charge rolling across the plain. Dust flew from under their mounts, sunlight glinting on bronze helmets and polished lance tips. They cut diagonally toward the Persian center, moving not just with speed, but with purpose, like an arrow aimed straight at the heart. Persian infantry in the gap scrambled to close ranks, but it was too late. The impact of the companions was a hammer blow. Lances drove forward, shields splintered, and men were thrown aside in the shock of the collision. Alexander himself was at the point of the wedge, his plume visible even in the chaos, Bucephus carrying him like a force of nature. The Persian center rippled and began to tear apart. For a moment, the royal standard of Darius was clearly visible ahead, a gleaming target above the chaos. Macedonian cavalry pressed deeper, widening the gap, as infantry followed in their wake. On the left, Parmenian's men still fought grimly to hold the line. Word reached Alexander that they were close to collapse, but he made the call to press forward. Victory here, at the core, could make the struggle on the left irrelevant. It was a gamble, but one he was willing to take. The Persians now faced a deadly choice: close the gap and risk losing the flanks, or reinforce the flanks and allow the center to be crushed. The hesitation was fatal. Alexander's wedge drove deeper, breaking the formation into isolated knots of resistance. Somewhere behind him, a companion shouted that they could see Darius himself. Whether it was truly the king or just a royal guard in similar armor, it didn't matter. The cry sparked a surge in the Macedonians, who fought with renewed ferocity. The Persian heart was breaking, and Alexander was not about to let it mend. The moment Alexander's charge cracked the Persian center, the battlefield shifted from tense equilibrium to chaotic unraveling. The dust thickened, turning sunlight into a hazy gold that blurred friend and foe alike. Through it all, the Macedonian wedge pressed forward, the companions hacking and thrusting, their lances now splintered and replaced by swords drawn for close fighting. From the elevated platform of his royal chariot, Darius caught sight of the rupture in his lines. What he saw must have chilled him. The elite immortals, once a wall of polished shields, were now bent and buckled, their formation split into fragments. The companions were pushing straight toward him, and the gap between them was closing by the heartbeat. Panic is a strange contagion. It doesn't start with the weakest. It starts with the watchful, the men who notice when something has gone irreversibly wrong. A few of Darius's guards began edging their horses toward the rear. Others followed, and within moments, the ripple became a current. Darius hesitated. Historians still debate whether he considered staying to rally his men, or if the decision to flee was instant. In that heartbeat of uncertainty, the battle might still have turned, but the moment passed. With a sharp pull on the reins, the King of Kings turned his chariot away from the front and began to retreat. Alexander saw it. Whether he recognized Darius himself or simply understood the signal, he knew the effect it would have. The sight of the royal chariot fleeing would echo like a shout across the Persian lines, and it did. Whole ranks began to waver, some breaking outright, others fighting with the desperation of men who knew their cause was already lost. The companions urged Alexander to pursue, their voices carrying over the din. Catching Darius here and now could end the war in a single stroke. But from the far left came a frantic messenger. Parmenion was in danger of being overrun. The Persian cavalry there, unaware of their king's retreat, were still pressing with brutal force. It was a decision that would haunt tacticians for centuries. Alexander turned his horse not toward the fleeing king, but toward his struggling left wing. To abandon Parmenion would mean losing a third of his army, perhaps more. The king's capture could wait. The survival of his army could not. The ride across the battlefield was like crossing a storm. The dust was so dense that shapes loomed suddenly, like ships out of fog. Wounded men staggering back, riderless horses plunging past, knots of Macedonian and Persian fighters locked in deadly struggle. Alexander cut through them, Bucephalus bounding forward with tireless power. When he reached the left, the scene was grim. The Macedonian cavalry was hard-pressed, their horses lathered, their riders bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. The Persians here fought like they had not heard of the king's flight, or perhaps they didn't care. They had their own victory in sight. Alexander's arrival changed everything. With a rallying cry, he plunged into the melee, his companions smashing into the Persian flank. The pressure broke almost instantly. Some Persians wheeled to flee, others were cut off and forced to surrender. The momentum shifted, as if someone had turned the tide by hand. By the time the dust began to settle, the plain was a patchwork of scattered fights and long trails of retreat. Darius was gone, the Persian army shattered, and the field belonged to Macedonia. The sun hung low in the sky now, its light painting the haze in shades of bronze and bloodless gold. The Battle of Gaugamela was over, but the story of what it meant was just beginning. When the last cries of battle faded, the plain at Gaugamela lay eerily quiet, broken only by the distant drumming of retreating hooves. The Macedonians stood scattered across the field, many leaning on their spears or resting against their horses, their breaths heavy and labored. It was victory, yes, but the kind earned in sweat, dust, and exhaustion more than in the glamour of a swift triumph. Alexander dismounted, removing his helmet and shaking the dust from his hair. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign that the Persians might rally. He knew better than to assume a fleeing enemy was a defeated one, especially an empire as vast as Persia. In the distance, the remnants of Darius's chariot tracks still marked the soil, leading away from the field like a long scar. Several of Alexander's officers urged him to give chase immediately, convinced they could capture the king before nightfall. But Alexander shook his head. His men were exhausted, the horses foaming and trembling from the strain of the day. A reckless pursuit could end in disaster if the Persians had laid a trap. Instead, he turned his focus to consolidating the field. He sent the companion cavalry to sweep the surrounding hills for any Persian stragglers who might regroup, while the phalanx reformed into smaller units to guard key positions. Parmenion, still nursing bruises from his near-over run on the left wing, rode up to exchange a brief, weary smile with his king, a wordless acknowledgment that they had both walked the knife's edge today. Among the Macedonian ranks, soldiers swapped fragments of the day's chaos like traders bartering goods. One man swore he'd seen Darius's face before the king turned to flee. Another claimed the king's chariot had been struck by a Macedonian spear, forcing his retreat. And, of course, someone insisted the Persians had been undone by the curse of the birds that had circled their camp at dawn. Historians still debate whether such omens held sway, but to the soldiers, they were part of the battle's lore now. The Persian camp, abandoned in haste, was a trove of treasures. Gold cups, jeweled scabbards, and bolts of fine silk lay amid overturned tents. Macedonian soldiers moved among them with cautious wonder, less like looters and more like men stepping into a fable. Alexander ordered that the spoils be gathered and distributed according to rank, ensuring discipline and avoiding the chaos that could sour a victory. The strangest find came when a soldier returned carrying a small, intricately painted ivory box. Inside were vials of fragrant oil and a delicate comb of worked silver, items far removed from the tools of war. Whether it had belonged to a Persian noblewoman or Darius himself, no one could say. Alexander chuckled at the sight, remarking that even kings needed their grooming rituals. The men laughed, their voices lighter now that the fear had passed. As the sun began to sink, casting long shadows over the plain, the magnitude of the day began to settle in. They had faced an enemy that outnumbered them many times over. In open ground, under the eye of the Persian king-hand, they had prevailed. It was the kind of victory that would echo far beyond these dusty plains. Still, Alexander knew the war was not over. Darius lived, and as long as he did, Persia's vast resources could yet be rallied. But tonight, at least, Macedonia would rest. On ground they had claimed with blood and steel. The fires of the Macedonian camp burned bright as night fell, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the sharp tang of oil on polished armor. Somewhere in the dark, a soldier began to hum a tune, slow, steady, and strangely comforting after the chaos of the day. It spread through the camp like a shared breath, binding them together in the quiet aftermath of battle. Morning broke over the plains of Gaugamela with a deceptive stillness. The dust of yesterday's battle had settled into a pale, dry crust, and the air carried only the faint smell of smoke from the smoldering remains of the Persian camp. For the Macedonians, the day began not with the blare of horns, but with the measured routine of soldiers who knew they were now in undisputed control of the field. Alexander rose early, his rest shorter than he would have liked. Victories were rarely the time for deep sleep. His first task was to inspect the wounded. He moved among the makeshift tents that now served as field hospitals, speaking to men in low, steady tones. Some soldiers were swathed in bandages, others lay silent, their eyes half-lidded with fatigue and pain. Yet when their king appeared, many managed a salute or a murmured word of loyalty. It was in these quiet moments, rather than on the battlefield, that Alexander's legend deepened. He remembered names, spoke of past marches together, and even joked about scars, reminding one soldier that his new mark would make him irresistible when he returned home. The men laughed, and the sound cut through the heaviness like a fresh wind. Beyond the camp, the Persian dead still lay scattered across the plain. Macedonian burial parties moved in small groups, separating their own fallen for proper rites, and burning piles of broken weapons and splintered chariot frames. The elephants, though fewer than at other battles, had left their own grim traces, deep gouges in the earth where they had charged, and the bodies of handlers who had died trying to turn them in retreat. In the captured Persian supply train, the Macedonians found food stores, barrels of wine, and ornate wagons piled high with goods from across the empire. There were silks from India, spices from Arabia, and, curiously, a collection of carved ivory game boards and counters. One companion joked that perhaps Darius had planned to challenge Alexander to a match instead of a battle. Another replied that Alexander would have beaten him at that too, but probably in half the time. Parmenion brought word that the Persian survivors had scattered in several directions, with no coherent force left to challenge them in the immediate region. Darius himself had fled toward the east, beyond the Tigris, with a small escort. Whether he would regroup or vanish into exile remained uncertain. Alexander gathered his generals in the shade of a large tent, taken from the Persian command. Silk canopy rippled slightly in the breeze, a faint reminder of the wealth and power they had just struck down. Maps were spread on a low table, stones weighing down the corners. The king traced routes with his finger, one leading south toward Babylon, another east toward Ecbatana, where Darius might attempt to rally. The decision ahead would shape not just the next battle, but the future of the empire they were building. For now, the army needed rest. Orders were given for 2 days' halt. Horses would be reshoed, weapons repaired, and men fed before they moved again. The mood in the camp was not the wild elation of green soldiers after their first victory, but the steady, tempered confidence of a force that knew its own strength. As the sun dipped low again, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Alexander walked the perimeter of the camp. He paused often to speak with sentries, ask about their watch, or simply share a few quiet words. The campfires glowed brighter as night fell, and the hum of low conversation mixed with the occasional burst of laughter. In the distance, beyond the reach of firelight, the vast emptiness of the plain stretched on, silent witness to the day when the balance of power between East and West shifted forever. 2 days after the battle, the Macedonian army broke camp under a pale, cloudless sky. The victory at Gaugamela had cleared the road south, and Alexander's gaze was fixed on Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. The march began at a measured pace, the columns stretching for miles, their armor catching flashes of sunlight, like ripples on a bronze river. Word of the Persian defeat had traveled faster than the army itself. Villages along the route were strangely quiet at first, their people wary of what the arrival of a conquering force might mean. But when they saw the Macedonians passing in order, no looting, no fires, they grew bolder. Some brought baskets of dates, others pitchers of water, hoping to win favor with the new power that now ruled the land. Alexander rode near the front, flanked by his companions. Bucephalus moved with the same easy strength as ever, though his mane was still streaked with dust from the battle. The king's eyes scanned the horizon constantly, as if expecting Darius to appear out of thin air with a new army. But the land ahead remained open, the only movement the slow sway of palm trees in the distance. Midway through the march, they passed the remnants of a Persian supply depot. Here, the wealth of the empire showed itself in more than gold-fine rugs, heavy, bronze vessels, and an almost absurd number of peacock feathers, stored in bundles. One soldier, holding a fan of the feathers aloft, suggested they use them to shade the king, earning a sharp laugh from Alexander himself. Even in an army that had just faced down impossible odds, humor found a place. That night, they camped along the banks of a shallow river. The horses drank deeply, and men bathed the grit of Gaugamela from their skin. Around the fires, the talk turned from the battle to the future. Some wondered if Babylon would resist, others claimed it would open its gates without a fight. A few muttered about omens again, how the moon had looked strange the night before Gaugamela, and how perhaps that same omen would guide them now. Historians still debate how much Alexander himself listened to such talk, but he never dismissed it outright. On the third day, they saw the first signs of Babylon's reach, vast irrigation canals lined with date palms, and in the distance, herds of cattle grazing under the watch of shepherds. The air grew warmer, the land greener. The contrast with the dusty plains they had left behind was striking, and it lifted the spirits of even the most road-weary soldier. When they reached a low ridge, Alexander halted the column. From here, in the shimmering distance, they could see the faint outline of Babylon's wall stall, massive and impossibly long. The city lay like a great sleeping beast in the sun, its towers rising above the haze. Alexander studied it for a long moment. This was more than the next target, it was a prize that could cement his claim as master of the known world. But as he looked at those ancient walls, he knew the coming days would demand a different kind of battle, not one of spears and charges, but of diplomacy, patience, and the art of making enemies into subjects without breaking them entirely. the march resumed, the army moving steadily toward the city that had seen empires rise and fall, and would now greet the man who intended to join that history. As the Macedonian army drew closer, the scale of Babylon's fortifications became more apparent. The walls were said to be so thick that chariots could pass each other atop them, and their pale bricks reflected the midday sun like slabs of gold. Great gates broke the endless expanse at intervals, each flanked by towers painted in vivid blues and greens, adorned with reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons. The men had expected a siege. They murmured about how long it might take to bring down such walls, about the toll it would exact on both time and supplies. But Alexander, riding at the head of the column, kept his gaze forward with a calm certainty. He had been watching the city's approaches for hours now, and he sensed something unusual in its stillness. When the first Babylonian envoys appeared, they did not come with the stiff posture of negotiators, nor the defiance of men buying time. They came bearing olive branches and gifts. Robed in white linen, they bowed deeply before Alexander and spoke of the city's wish to open its gates without resistance. Babylon, they said, would rather serve the victor of Gaugamela than see its streets burned and its people slaughtered. It was a gesture that spoke of both pragmatism and shrewdness. The Babylonians had seen Persia's fate decided in a single day, and they knew which way the wind was blowing. Alexander, for his part, accepted their terms with the graciousness of a man who understood the value of an unbroken prize. The gates swung wide, and the Macedonians marched in not as conquerors, in a frenzy, but as disciplined soldiers under the watch of their king. The streets were broad and shaded, lined with merchant stalls and tall houses of baked brick. The people stood in clusters, watching the foreign army pass with expressions ranging from awe to curiosity. Children peered from doorways, some giggling, others too shy to meet the gaze of the armored strangers. Alexander's eyes, however, were drawn to the heart of the city. Rising above the rooftops was the Ziggurat Etemenanki, the fabled Tower of Babel in later stories, colossal, tiered structure of brick and stone, said to stretch toward the heavens themselves. Beside it stood the Temple of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, its gilded spire catching the light like a flame frozen in mid-air. The city's satrap approached, bowing low, and presented Alexander with a golden crown. The gesture was symbolic. Babylon rulers acknowledged him not just as a conqueror, but as a legitimate sovereign. Alexander accepted it without placing it on his head, a deliberate choice to show respect for local customs. He then ordered that the temples be protected and the priests allowed to continue their rites undisturbed. That night, a banquet was held in Alexander's honor. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fruits, honeycakes, and amphoras of wine. Musicians played stringed instruments and flutes, their melodies weaving through the torchlit air. For many of the Macedonians, it was their first taste of Babylonian luxury, and they approached it with a mix of wonder and suspicion. One soldier, staring at a dish of unfamiliar spiced fish, muttered that it looked more dangerous than anything they'd faced on the battlefield. His companion reminded him that the Persians had said the same about Macedonian cheese. Both laughed, the sound mingling with the music. Alexander himself mingled with Babylon's nobles, speaking through interpreters. Learning of the city's systems and resources, he was already thinking ahead. Babylon would be more than a trophy. It would be a cornerstone of his empire, a place where East and West could meet under his rule. Outside, the great city slept under the watch of new masters, its ancient walls intact, its people spared, and its future irrevocably bound to the man from Macedonia. Babylon, once entered, revealed itself not merely as a city, but as an entire world contained within walls. For the Macedonians who had spent years marching across barren plains and rocky passes, it was overwhelming. The air was thick with scents. They barely recognized cinnamon and frankincense drifting from temple courtyards, the savory smoke of street vendors grilling skewers of lamb, and the sharp tang of freshly baked bread from corner ovens. The streets bustled even in the wake of conquest. Merchants reopened their stalls, as if the change of rulers were no more than a shift in the weather. Goldsmiths hammered delicate filigree into jewelry. Potters shaped wet clay into amphorae, and scribes hunched over wax tablets, recording trade agreements as they had for centuries. Alexander moved through this tapestry with deliberate purpose. He visited the great temple of Marduk, removing his sandals before stepping inside. an act that caused murmurs among the priests. Standing beneath the towering figure of the god, he offered a sacrifice of perfumed oil and barley, a public gesture, to show he respected the city's traditions. Whether the priests truly accepted this foreign king or simply adapted for survival, historians still debate. In the royal palace, Alexander met with Babylon's administrators. The satrap, a cautious man named Macedonia, who had served Darius, pledged his loyalty and was confirmed in his position, an unexpected act that made the local elite breathe easier. Alexander knew the value of continuity. Replacing every official would have been a waste of both time and goodwill. For the army, Babylon was a wonderland of rest. Soldiers lounged in shaded courtyards, bathed in the cool waters of the Euphrates, fed canals, and even gambled on local board games they barely understood. One Macedonian boasted he had mastered the rules after a single match, only to lose his entire stash of silver coins before sundown. Yet beneath the ease, Alexander kept his mind on the broader campaign. Darius was still at large, somewhere east, beyond the mountains, and Persia's vast eastern territories remained untouched. Scouts reported that the king was gathering what forces he could, though it was unlikely he could field an army like Gaugamela again. One evening, Alexander convened his generals in a shaded garden within the palace. Oil lamps cast long, wavering shadows over the stone benches. Parmenion favored an immediate pursuit of Darius to end the war quickly. Others suggested consolidating control over Mesopotamia first, securing supply lines and loyal garrisons before venturing farther east. Alexander listened, then spoke with quiet certainty. Darius will not escape forever, but an empire is not won in a single chase. It is built by holding what you take. His words, calm yet decisive, ended the debate. For the night, as the days passed, the city's people began to regard the Macedonians with less suspicion. Children followed soldiers in the streets, imitating their marching steps. Craftsmen found eager customers among the foreigners, and taverns did brisk business in wine and beer. Still, there were pockets of quiet resistance, scribbled messages, warning of rebellion, whispered plans in back rooms. Alexander noticed, but did not crush them. Not yet. Instead, he let Babylon breathe under his rule, allowing its citizens to see that life could continue and perhaps even thrive without Darius. The balance was delicate, but the young king understood this dance as well as he understood war. And in the courtyards of Babylon, the seeds of his vision for a united empire began to take root. The novelty of Babylon's splendor did not dull Alexander's focus for long. Within weeks, preparations began for the next stage of the campaign. The great city would remain a jewel in his crown, but the war's true end lay farther east, where Darius still clung to a shadow of his empire. Before departing, Alexander oversaw the fortification of key points within Babylon. Macedonian garrisons were placed at the main gates and along the walls, not to occupy the city with brute force, but to ensure its allegiance. He confirmed Macedonia as satrap, but assigned a Macedonian financial officer to oversee taxation, ensuring that the city's wealth flowed toward his growing empire. Still, his time in Babylon left its mark on him. He had begun wearing local garments during formal events, a long, flowing robe over his usual armor, an image that caused murmurs among his officers. Some saw it as a diplomatic gesture, others as a dangerous drift toward foreign ways. "He's becoming more Persian by the day," one veteran grumbled, yet the soldiers accepted it, for their king's charisma outweighed their misgivings. In the evenings, Alexander often walked the hanging gardens, or what the locals claimed were the remains of them. Terraced stone platforms rose above the city, overgrown in places but still alive with flowering vines and exotic trees brought from distant lands. From the topmost level, he could look out over the Euphrates, its slow current glinting under the setting sun. It was here, surrounded by beauty and stillness, that he often spoke in low tones with Hephaestion, his closest companion, about the campaigns still to come. When the day came to leave, the army's march from Babylon was a spectacle in itself. Locals lined the streets to watch, their expressions a mix of relief, admiration, and curiosity. Alexander rode at the head, wearing both his Macedonian cuirass and a purple cloak gifted by the Babylonian priests, deliberate blending of identities. The route took them northeast, toward the Zagros Mountains and the city of Susa. Along the way, Alexander's army moved through fertile plains dotted with canals and farms. The people here offered tribute without resistance: grain, cattle, and amphorae of wine. Some villagers even sent musicians to play as the army passed, a small but telling sign that fear of Persia's might had been replaced by acceptance of Macedonia's rule. Around the campfires at night, the men speculated about what awaited them. In Susa, rumors spoke of treasuries overflowing with gold, greater even than what they had found in Babylon. One soldier swore he had heard from a merchant that the palace floors were inlaid with lapis lazuli and turquoise. Another joked that they would all need extra mules just to carry home the spoils. But Alexander kept his mind on strategy. Susa's submission would open the road deeper into Persia's heartland. If Darius fled there, he would corner him. If the city surrendered, it would be another stone in the foundation of his empire. Either way, Alexander intended to move swiftly. One evening, as they camped near a small village, a sudden rainstorm swept across the plain. The men laughed and cursed as they scrambled to keep their gear dry, but Alexander stood bareheaded in the downpour, letting the water wash the dust of the road from his skin. "The gods are giving us a clean start," he remarked, a line that spread through the camp like an omen of fortune. By the time the rain passed and the fires burned again, the army's spirits were high. Ahead lay Susa, the mountains, and beyond them the vast unknown. And somewhere in that distance, Darius waited, whether as a king ready to fight or a fugitive running from fate. No one could yet say. The road to Susa wound steadily upward into the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Here, the air was cooler, the nights sharper, and the land dotted with clusters of hardy trees. The Macedonian army moved at a measured pace, wary of ambush in the narrower passes. Alexander had no illusions. Darius might still command loyal forces, and mountain terrain was the perfect ground for a desperate stand. As the column advanced, scouts returned with unexpected news. Susa had no intention of resisting. The city's envoys, dressed in rich but travel-worn robes, arrived carrying gifts of gold vessels and fine carpets. They bowed deeply before Alexander and offered the keys to the city. Word of Gaugamela had clearly reached them, and the city had decided that survival was preferable to a hopeless defense. Alexander accepted with the ease of a man who knew the value of bloodless conquest. He promised to respect the city's temples and customs, and in return, Susa pledged supplies and opened its treasury to him. When the army entered, the soldiers could hardly believe their eyes. The palace was unlike anything they had seen before. Walls inlaid with glazed tiles shimmered in turquoise and deep blue, and columns rose like the trunks of marble trees, their capitals carved into double-headed bulls. Floors of polished stone reflected the torchlight, and gold seemed to glint. From every corner, the treasury of Susa was legendary, and now its riches belonged to Alexander. Chests of gold and silver coins were stacked like fortifications, jewels in every shade: emerald, ruby, sapphire-filled, carved boxes. There were even bolts of cloth so fine they seemed to float in the air, dyed in colors the Macedonians had no names for. Historians later estimated the haul at tens of thousands of talents, an amount so vast that it redefined the economic weight of Alexander's empire. One curious discovery drew particular attention: a set of ancient weapons, said to have belonged to Cyrus the Great himself. Whether the claim was true or not, Alexander took them as a symbol, wearing the sword at his side during the formal ceremonies in the city. Not all moments were solemn. In the palace gardens, Macedonian soldiers wandered in awe at the carefully tended orchards and reflecting pools. One man, leaning too far over a marble balustrade to smell an exotic flower, toppled headfirst into a lily pond. His comrades pulled him out, sputtering and dripping, to the laughter of everyone nearby. Even Alexander, passing by, couldn't resist a smile. But beneath the splendor, the young king remained vigilant. Darius had not been found in Susa. He had fled further east, toward the mountainous stronghold of The chase would have to continue. For now, Alexander ordered a brief stay. The army would rest, resupply, and prepare for the long march through the mountains. Horses would be reshed, weapons repaired, and wagons loaded with as much of treasure as they could carry without slowing the advance. At night, from the palace balcony, Alexander looked east. The lamps of Susa glowed below him, but beyond the darkness stretched the road to the last great confrontation with the Persian king. Somewhere out there, Darius was running, and Alexander intended to close the distance. The march from Susa to Ecbatana was unlike the steady, sun-baked progress through Mesopotamia. Here, the road climbed relentlessly into the Zagros Mountains, twisting through narrow passes where sheer cliffs dropped away into shadowed valleys. The air grew colder each day, and the men wrapped themselves in cloaks against the wind that whistled between the peaks. Alexander pushed the pace. Every delay was a gift to Darius, and the king knew it. Messengers were sent ahead to scout the passes and to spread word among the villages. Surrender, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will face the fate of Persia's armies. The policy worked. Small settlements offered supplies and guides, without a fight, preferring to align with the rising power rather than die for a fading one. Still, the terrain took its toll. Wagons struggled on the steep inclines, and in some places, they had to be disassembled and carried piece by piece up rocky slopes. Horses slipped on loose gravel, and men grumbled about the thin air. One soldier joked that the mountains were trying to fight the battle themselves by wearing down their legs before they ever saw the enemy. Halfway through the march, word came from the scouts. Darius had left Ecbatana before their arrival, taking with him the remnants of his treasury, and what troops remained loyal. The Persian king was now heading farther east, toward the remote lands of Bactria. Some Macedonian officers cursed at the news, their frustration at the endless pursuit spilling over. But Alexander saw it differently. Every step Darius took eastward pulled him deeper into isolation, farther from the heart of his former empire. When they finally reached Ecbatana, the city's gates were open. The satrap surrendered without resistance, offering tribute and the remaining Persian stores. Though less wealthy than Susa, Ecbatana still yielded rich carpets, fine metalwork, and the strategic advantage of being a major stronghold in the highlands. Alexander ordered a garrison installed and the passes secured. It was here that he made a pivotal decision. The bulk of the army would rest through the harshest part of winter, while he took a lighter, faster force to continue the chase. The companions, the Hypaspists, and the most mobile units of the phalanx would ride with him. The rest would follow in the spring. It was a bold move, one that carried risk, but Alexander had no intention of letting the Persian king vanish into the east unchallenged. Before departing, he addressed his men in the main square. Cloaked against the mountain chill, he spoke of the victories they had won, the riches they had gathered, and the glory that awaited them if they brought Darius to account. His words were measured, but they carried the steel edge of resolve. That night, the campfires burned bright against the cold, the flickering light catching on the gold and silver ornaments taken from Susa and Ecbatana. Men whispered about the journey ahead over mountain ridges, across unknown rivers, into lands where no Macedonian army had ever marched. Some feared the distance, others relished the challenge, and far to the east, beyond the last ridge of the Zagros, the fugitive king of kings pressed on, the shadow of his relentless pursuer stretching ever closer. The pursuit eastward was relentless. Alexander's chosen force moved faster than the main army could have, cutting across valleys and ridges with the efficiency of men who had marched together for years. The days blurred into a rhythm of riding. At dawn, pushing hard until the sun dipped behind the peaks, and making camp wherever there was water and enough level ground to pitch tents. Villagers along the route spoke of Darius passing days or, sometimes only hours before. Each account painted a picture of a king diminished. His entourage was smaller now, his soldiers weary and thinned by desertion. Yet he still carried the remnants of the royal treasury and the dignity of his title, even in flight. Historians still debate whether Darius believed he could rally again in the Far East, or if he was simply trying to escape Alexander's reach altogether. The trail wound into harsher country, where the mountains gave way to vast arid plateaus. The wind was dry here, whipping dust into the faces of men and horses alike. Supplies grew tight, and the pace took its toll, but Alexander drove them on, sensing the chase was nearing its end. Then, one morning, scouts returned with urgent news. Darius's own satrap, Bessus of Bactria, had turned against him. The Persian king had been seized by his own officers, likely with the intention of using him as a bargaining chip or removing him altogether to claim the throne themselves. Alexander pushed his men harder still, hoping to reach Darius before harm could come to him. But when they finally caught up to the satrap's camp in the heat of a dusty afternoon, it was too late. The royal tent stood in disarray, and Darius lay within, wounded and abandoned by those who had betrayed him. Accounts differ on his final moments. Some say he lived long enough for Alexander to offer him water and words of respect, promising that his family would be treated with honor. Others claim the Macedonian king arrived only after the Persian ruler had already succumbed. Whatever the truth, Alexander took the news solemnly. He covered the body with his own cloak and ordered it to return to Persepolis for burial with full royal honors. The death of Darius ended the war for the Persian throne, but it also marked a turning point for Alexander himself. No longer was he simply the avenger of Greece or the conqueror of a single empire. Now he was master of it, heir to the legacy of the Achaemenid kings. That night, the camp was quiet. Victory should have brought celebration, but the manner of its arrival carried a strange weight. The men sat in small groups, speaking in low tones, as if aware that they had just witnessed the close of one age and the uncertain dawn of another. Alexander stood apart for a long while, looking east into the darkness. Beyond lay Bactria, the steppes, and lands that stretched farther than most of his men could imagine. His victories had brought him to the edge of the known world, but not yet to the edge of his ambition. Wind-down fires burned low, their orange glow softening the hard edges of the camp. The restless noise of the day gave way to the muted sounds of night horses shifting in their sleep, the faint rustle of canvas in the breeze, and somewhere a lone soldier humming a tune from home. Alexander's army, weary but unbroken, lay scattered beneath the vast sweep of stars. The constellations looked the same as they had in Macedonia, though here they hung over foreign mountains and valleys, marking the path to futures yet unknown. In the quiet, the dust of the road seemed to settle not just on the ground, but over the memories of battles fought, cities taken, and kings dethroned. Men pulled their cloaks tighter, letting the warmth seep in as their eyes grew heavy. And as the night deepened, the thought of tomorrow's march drifted away. For now, there was only the comfort of rest, the steady rhythm of breathing, and the gentle pull of dreams of home, of glory, and of what lay just beyond the horizon. End of script. Good night.